And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning and welcome to The Law Show here on CIL 650. On today's episode, we're focusing on immigration law, and I am joined in studio by Rudy Kischer and Alex Stojcevic from Maynard Kitcher Stojcevic Immigration and Citizenship Lawyers in Vancouver. Nice to see you again, both. Alex, good to see you. Were in the first show and then you took off. It's good to have you back.
Thank you, Sterling. Good to be here.
Well, and Rudy, good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning, Sterling.
Tell us a little bit about the firm. Gordon Maynard is absent today, but you three are partners in a firm, Alex, that's been around for how long?
Well, Gordon Maynard and I started the firm in 2002, and Rudy joined us in 2005. So we've been in our current sort of incarnation now for the better part of 10 years.
Okay, and Rudy, what is the bulk of the work of the firm? Who are your clients mostly?
I'd say 50% of our work usually comes from companies, corporations that are either looking for foreign talent, so they're bringing in engineers, or they might have global mobility issues, so they're moving executive management around, coming into Canada from places like the UK or from the United States.
Okay.
Another percentage is sort of what we'd call sort of our mom and pop business, is sort of the spousal applications where people are meet somebody abroad and they want to bring them here to Canada to live with them. We also have a small percentage of our business which is based on litigation, so people that have run into problems with immigration officers or the immigration system, and we also do that work. And we also represent individuals that want to immigrate to Canada, that are here working, or students are here and they see an opportunity for them to immigrate. And then finally, we have a percentage of business that is based on business people that are coming to Canada to invest and start businesses, and they want sort of someone to guide them through the immigration process and that.
And now we have this new Citizenship Act, which was proclaimed last year, but which in many of its forms, Alex, won't even come into effect until this summer. Talk to us a little bit about, first of all, what this act is and why it's taking so long from its proclamation last year to implementation perhaps a year later.
Well, there's a number of different elements to the Act, some of which are controversial and some of which are not. Some of which are probably reasonably popular, I would think. At its face, the Conservatives are calling it the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, and the tagline that they've used as a department is harder to get, easier to lose.
Okay.
So on the harder to get side, there are changes to how we define residence. The word residence is now defined as physical presence in Canada. That's to deal with a lot of ambiguity in the existing 1977 Act about what living in Canada actually means. And from that perspective, it's useful in that a lot of litigation around citizenship is probably permanently resolved by moving from a relatively ambiguous phrase like residence to one that's physical presence.
So this, but I need to interrupt. So this says basically now there are new provisions that say you must actually physically be in Canada X number of days or weeks per year. Prior to that, it was a gray area.
It was a bit of a gray area. The government interpreted it as physical presence was required. However, the courts were all over the map on what residence actually meant, and citizenship judges had a lot of discretion in terms of deciding who met residence requirements and who didn't.
Okay.
So now we have a test that's relatively straightforward. Physical presence, 4 years out of 6. There's exceptions for special humanitarian situations, where people are providing service to Canada or are working for Canada in some capacity abroad. But other than that, it's a pretty strict 4 years out of 6 test. In addition to that, there are tax filer requirements that didn't exist in the previous legislation. There's also a greater emphasis on language ability, and that regulation has also been altered. Now people will have to prove that they speak English at a Canadian language benchmark 5 or French at a similar level.
Okay.
For which they'll have to prove that they've either completed English education somewhere in the world, either a diploma or a degree, or language instruction for newcomers training in Canada at a certain level, or finally pass a language test at language benchmark 4, which is not a very high benchmark, I should add, but it requires you to at least show that you can have a basic conversation at a level that people can understand.
Well, so far, in terms of popularity, and you alluded to this already.
Yeah, I don't
Alex,
think there's much.
You're not getting a lot of argument from the average Canadian
No.
as to these provisions and these adjustments, at least.
So a lot of these, although the bill was passed in June, will take a long time to change forms, training of citizenship staff, and then on the harder to lose side, which we'll get to in a minute, there are certain administrative procedures that will have to be brought forward and will have to be created basically out of scratch, and that's why there's a delay.
Okay.
I think one part that we missed there was the intention to reside in Canada. Before, if somebody had been working in Canada for 6 years, for example, applied for citizenship, and then had put their time in and was ready to leave, they could leave. Under the current, the new act, you'll have to have the intention to reside not only when you apply for your application, but also when it's processed and it's finalized. So where if somebody was looking, for example, to move abroad to work for an international corporation, they would have a problem if it was shown later. They could possibly be written up for misrepresentation if they then got their citizenship and left to, say, work for Apple in Seattle.
Oh, I
That
see.
would be seen as a misrepresentation.
There's no requirement under the current act that way. So I mean that's a harder to get your head around section. There's some questions whether or not that provision will
Actually
pass
muster?
constitutional
Right,
scrutiny,
yeah.
but who knows?
That-
So how much of the new Citizenship Act, Rudy, is actually in force that we would recognize as, there's one of the new changes? Are there any that are up and running yet, or is it still in the implementation process?
I think most of it's in the implementation process. Right?
I'll tell you one change that has happened, and that is citizenship judges who have the ultimate say under the current act on who becomes a citizen and who doesn't, and who are patronage appointments traditionally by the government in power.
Definitely.
Those are now largely ceremonial positions.
Right.
It's officers. That part of the new bill has actually taken effect. It's officers now who are full-time civil servants who make final decisions on applications. In fairness, that's administratively probably a decision that makes sense. A lot of judges rely anyway on what the officers tell them.
Of course.
So having the officers have final say is probably easier from an administrative perspective.
So up until this point, were one of those ceremonial citizenship judge political appointees, Rudy, did they actually have the power to deny citizenship?
Oh, they
all the
did.
time.
They did, and they often did it. So I mean, it was, when Alex talks about sort of, it's good in one respect, that it's probably good for 90% of the cases that the actual officers are now making those decisions. But
Okay.
for that 10% where there was some sort of subjectivity as to had the person be resident here, and I mean, a good example for some is a Canadian executive working for a company here where he spends a lot of time abroad.
Right.
He's
At head office or whatever. Sure.
Head office. He's an executive. Maybe he's flying down to South America. He's developing a mine down there. He spends more than half the year outside of Canada. Is he going to meet that citizenship test? Well, under the current law, if he was, resident, the definition of resident is a little bit wide open. If his home is here, but he's working abroad for a Canadian company, a citizenship judge could take a look at that and make a positive decision, right? Under the new act, that's going to be totally gone. Right.
So when does this change, Alex, in terms of individuals, perhaps not even here in Canada, but who are looking to move to Canada for employment purposes and the old classic, just looking for a better life? What about them from afar in terms of applying to try and integrate themselves with these new rule changes that few Canadians, if any, understand? What's it going to be like for a foreigner trying to get into the country?
Well, the reality is the new citizenship rules will apply to all new permanent residents, because if you're not eligible by June, and to be eligible, you will already have to be a permanent resident if you want to apply. The new rules already apply to you, and you will have to make your peace with the reality of the new regime, which is 4 years out of 6. So you're going to have to be a permanent resident. I mean, some of the really significant changes is that our old system allowed for credit for time you spent in Canada on a study permit or a work permit.
Sure.
There's no longer any credit for that. You have to be a permanent resident for a minimum amount of time. In addition to that, a very important change is how they calculate days. Up till now, a day is a day, and there's no penalty for years where you weren't in Canada for 183 days. If you were in Canada for 2 years and then 181 days in another year, you could use those towards getting to the 1,095-day cutoff, or the eligibility cutoff, for residents under the old test. Now, any year where you don't spend 183 days, which is tied again to the tax filing requirements, you can't count any days in Canada. And unfortunately, what that means for new immigrants and for people who would be eligible on up to June 1st, but may not be on June 2nd, because if they became permanent residents in October, there isn't even 183 days in the year. Maybe they were in Canada the whole time, October to December 31st.
Right.
That time won't count for them.
So you're pushing back a bunch
You're
of
pushing
people.
back. It won't really be 6 years. It'll be 6 years plus another 3-4 months for a lot of people.
Okay.
So our message to get out there and should be that, look, if you're eligible this year and you have been putting this off, now's the time to do it. It may be a lot harder to do this for you going forward.
What's June 1st? What's so magic about June 1st, Rudy?
Well, that's the date that's rumored. We don't have an official announcement yet, but that's when these provisions are supposed to come into effect.
Okay.
So after June 1st, any new applications going forward will have to meet this new test. So somebody that's been here and may qualify today under the past rules should really come see a lawyer and see if they actually meet the requirements and get that application in as fast
Is
as
it likely,
possible.
Alex, that someone who up until this moment has qualified under the old situation may be completely ineligible just as a result of the rule changes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There'll be all kinds of situations where people will be ineligible.
So are you people already at Maynard Kisher Stojkovic, are you already hearing, getting calls and inquiries from people going, well, you know, I'm in the mix right now. My paperwork is in the flow. As far as I know, I'm still completely eligible, but I just heard about a rule change. Now what? Are you getting calls from people like that?
We are, I would say.
Yeah, no, we've done consultations where people are coming up and they're saying, what are these new changes? What's
Sure.
going on? Should I apply now? And we take a look at their situation, and often it's like, yeah, you better apply now because you're going to lose credit, as Alex noted, you know, if you weren't here for that half a year when you became a permanent resident, or if you were here earlier as a student or a work permit, those two years that would have counted before, you're going to lose those. So those people are extremely, they're missing an opportunity where their permanence is going to take passage. Another thing is, as we talked about, people that have some subjectivity left in terms of that they travel a lot outside of Canada. Their home is Canada, but they're outside for Canada for various reasons, maybe for humanitarian reasons, such as they're helping a sick relatives, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Those people, they're going to find that the new rule is hard and fast. Physical presence in Canada. We don't care whether you had a dying grandmother or cancer, you went back to help for 6 months. There's going to be no exception for that under the new rules. And we're like, well, you should use your chance now to apply.
Well, I mean, I don't want to. There are still humanitarian and compassionate exceptions, but it's a different level of test. It's going to
Okay.
be really exceptional situations.
Yeah.
And it'll be up to people to prove that there was nobody to look after grandma.
Right,
and
right.
It's going to be a lot more difficult going forward. I agree with Rudy.
Now, a lot of most of the cases that so far we've been describing deal with people who are clients of yours, who would be either companies looking to bring a talented young person into work in Canada and join their force, or individuals looking to come into Canada to work. What about the another category of immigrant altogether? Perhaps the family, the spouses of some of these people that you're dealing with, or people, relatives from who the family has been here now, they're established, they've applied for and received their Canadian citizenship, and now it's time to bring some more people in from the old country. Does the new Citizenship Act, Rudy, cause any changes to that family's plans for bringing people into Canada?
Well, it's just going to delay the time that, before they'll be able to apply. So it's going to push everything back, right? They're going to definitely, whereas before they would have qualified within 3 years, they're not going to qualify now for at least 4 years, if not longer.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been other citizenship changes over the last few years that has had an impact on arrangements abroad. For example, we have now almost everyone who's born to a Canadian citizen abroad is a Canadian citizen themselves. But beyond that, we have now limited Canadian citizenship to that first generation born abroad. It's not broadly known in Canada, but the reality is since about 2011, 2009 to 2011, when these changes were implemented, if you have children outside of Canada because you're working abroad,
Sure,
or
they're
something
automatically
like that,
Canadians,
yes, but their children are no longer. So
I
it now
see.
cuts off at the first generation born abroad.
So you can imagine somebody working in Singapore. You know, their father worked in Singapore. Maybe they were born in Singapore. They go back to Canada. They complete a degree in Canada.
Right.
They go back to Singapore. They're working in Singapore, and they have a child. Well, they were born abroad, and therefore their child isn't a Canadian citizen. I mean, most
right.
people assume that there's a bloodline, that if that bloodline's unbroken, that person will receive citizenship. And in a lot of countries, that's the way you get citizenship. Germany, for example, you can be gone for 500 years, but if you can trace your bloodline back and say, listen, I'm ethnically German, I come from Germany,
Right.
they'll accept you're a German citizen.
Interesting.
In Canada, we're done after one generation abroad.
The policy reason for that largely flew out of, if you recall, the shooting war that Hezbollah had with the Israelis back in 2006. The net effect of that was Canada arranged for an airlift of close to 8,000 or 9,000 Canadian citizens of Lebanese origin.
There were something like 40,000 Canadians in Lebanon.
In Lebanon,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Many of these people were brought to Canada to get out of harm's way.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, what occurred, fortunately or unfortunately, 90% of them went home right afterwards.
Went back. Exactly. Yeah.
And there was a question raised at the time amongst both policymakers, politicians, and the public. Well, wait a minute. How come these people are Canadian? And it turned out a lot of them were second-generation Canadians, third-generation Canadians, people whose parents might have come in the 70s, made refugee claims during the war in Lebanon. And then there was a question asked, well, if they're not filing taxes in Canada, why are we paying for them to be airlifted and brought here?
Sure.
And then there was a question around the whole idea of how Canadian, are people in this situation. And that was a debate that was held, and the department and the government took a position that perhaps it's time that we cap this bloodline issue at a reasonable level. And I mean, you can debate whether it's reasonable at first generation.
I mean, you take a look at Hong Kong, for example. In Hong Kong, I lived in Hong Kong for a year. There are approximately 250,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong.
I've met a few of them myself.
So if something was to happen in Hong Kong, what's our responsibility to 250,000 Canadian citizens in Hong Kong? And, that's the debate that had to be had.
Yeah,
Right?
that's a lot of people.
We're talking the new Citizenship Act. The one you hadn't heard about yet, perhaps. I know I'm a little new to this file as well. Our guests are Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojcevic from the Vancouver immigration firm Maynard Kisher Stojcevic on The Law Show here on CIL 650. We're going to talk about, the tax provisions. All of a sudden, there's a whole new thing going on there. And what about dual citizens? Well, we'll find out after this quick timeout.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.